Welcome, friends, to our Singularity Salon event, where we have with us Divya Chander discussing now what follows after the lockdown. Divya is a physician, a neuroscience, and a futurist. She has been trained at Harvard, University of California, University of San Francisco, the Salk Institute, and right now she also advises in California on a COVID task force as a project director, and she's also working as a member of the NASA and White House collaborative task force on the US healthcare system to improve the response and resilience on the COVID-19. Divya, welcome. Hey, hi Divya.
Hello, how are you?
Welcome, welcome. We are very excited. It was a pleasure and honor to have you a couple of years in our first Singularity Summit event talking about the future of health. And now we are equally happy and have the pleasure to have you discuss the post-COVID era and what will happen after the lockdown.
All right, so thank you so much for inviting me, Nikki. It's always such a pleasure. Nikki is one of our best partners, actually, for Singularity in the entire world. So let's get started. Let's make sure I'm sharing my screen appropriately. So here I am. And can you hear me well?
Yes, very well.
So thank you, Nikki, for inviting me. And it's so lovely to be with you all. And I think I want to open by saying that one thing we ought to be doing is using this pandemic and thinking about our future as a way to craft an entirely new future. We cannot go back to business as usual. And the reason we can't go back to business as usual is because I think that we are in this crucial moment where there is plasticity in the world, where people their worlds have been so uprooted that we have a chance to take root and hold and do something new. So in fact, the first thing I'm going to open with is an initiative I'm working on. It's a global initiative, and we have been trying to reimagine what our future looks like based on the fact that we are all, as a planet, interdependent upon one another. So when you have some time, I would love for you all to go to this website that you see at the bottom of your screen, OneShared.world, and read the pledge, and if it means something to you, sign that pledge so that we can create that better world together. Now, I'm actually opening with what Nikki asked, which is, how is it that we imagine going through these phases? What is this pandemic going to look like? And am I covering the screen with the picture of the two of us? Is this all right, Nikki? Can you see this?
Yes, it's good. Yes.
Okay, beautiful. So we can probably take our lessons from history. This is a slide from the 1918 Spanish flu. And this is data coming from the United States. And I want you to take a look at this graph way at the bottom here. What you can see is that the flu didn't happen in just one wave. It happened in 3 waves. And this first wave is by far the smallest wave, okay? So that took place in March or spring of 1918. And people thought things were better, and they began to relax social distancing and wearing masks. And what you see then is by the fall of 1918, there was a massive return, a new wave. And in fact, the number of deaths increased something like 5-fold. And then even as this one would wane, there was a third wave in the winter of 1919. So I suspect, especially because the human body has not yet come into contact or seen this virus before, that we're easily going to see at least 3 waves. Further, we're in the Northern Hemisphere, and we were hit first. The Southern Hemisphere is yet to see its wave, and that will be coming soon. And just to give a little perspective, I've been downloading this over time. This is basically what the statistics looked like on March 12th, when we first began to understand that something was happening. Only 167,000 cases in the world. And you see that China is the #1 country in the world. As we move through time, this was 1 week later, and the number of cases has almost tripled. And moving in time, this was another 2 weeks later, and we were at 1.8 million cases. The US has now taken the spot for number one from number 8, and that continued to climb. So 3.6 million as of last week, and as of yesterday, 4.1 million. The US has the dubious distinction of still being in first place. But as Nikki mentioned at the beginning, Greece is doing extremely, extremely well. In fact, in a country of about 10.7 million people, you only have about 2,700 cases. And as a comparison, Belgium has almost the same number of people, and they have something on the order of 47,000 cases. So what's new? What is it that Greece is doing that is so different? Well, is it testing? So if you look at this chart from Our World in Data, it shows how many tests Greece is doing per 1,000 people. And Greece is at about 9, and actually it's pretty far down on the list. Take a look at the US. As of yesterday, we had done about 3 times as many tests as Greece. So that wasn't the entire answer, and that's quite interesting. So this chart may give a little bit more of an impression. So this is actually a chart of when Greece enacted all of its social distancing rules. And you can see that through, say, mid-March, Greece wasn't actually tracking its cases very well, right? You see that? Because this is not because there were no cases. This is because Greece wasn't tracking them. And when they finally started doing so in mid-March, they noticed there was a peak also in cases. But take a look at the green up here. Greece was already starting to enact a number of measures like closing down schools and shutting down small, larger gatherings. And any non-essential businesses began to close by mid-March. The stay-at-home order came in the 3rd week of March. Now let's compare that to the United States. So in the US, I live in San Francisco, California. We were one of the first cities in the entire US to lock down. In fact, I gave my talk for the Singularity Summit on COVID on March 16th. And as I was driving back from the studio from Singularity University in Silicon Valley, they told us that the next morning we wouldn't be able to go anywhere again. So that was the very last thing I was able to do in public. The rest of the state closed down 2 days later. New York City closed down 1 week later. And this may be part of the problem. When I think we had a lot of latent cases we didn't know about. There is now evidence by an autopsy that a woman in San Jose, which is in Silicon Valley, she died of coronavirus, but they thought it was a heart attack. They found out it was coronavirus, and that means she had been exposed way back in January. So it was pervasive probably in hotspots in the US before we knew anything. The other thing that's happening in the United States is different states are closing down at different rates and they're reopening at different rates. As you can see, Greece has a unified policy towards this. And I don't know, Nikki, maybe you can tell me later in the Q&A, but I don't know if you're getting as much pushback from Greek citizens. It seems that they really do understand the need for this, whereas there seems to be some sort of fracturing in the United States. And there have been a lot of protests and demonstrations recently about the need to open up because the economy is faltering. So that brings me to our next subject. I've been thinking deeply about how we open the United States, both on the state level, on the federal level, and on the global level. And one thing it's going to require is global surveillance. And what does global surveillance mean? We need to develop a global immune system, not only for this pandemic, but for future pandemics. And one way to do this is simply to track them, okay? Now, who was supposed to be tracking this pandemic? Well, it was these guys, right? It was the World Health Organization. Now, I don't know what the opinion is currently amongst the Greek people about the World Health Organization. This was founded after World War II, and their founding documents say that they are to direct and coordinate international health work. One of the problems is they have been underfunded because they rely on donations from all different countries, and the US was their biggest donor. Now, our administration is even pulling away some of this funding. They were already understaffed. And then there's a lot of political things they have to deal with, right? So China didn't want them to come in. And they didn't push back on them. So they weren't able to deliver to the rest of the world some of the information that they could have used. Also, the CDC, which was another way, it was the American Centers for Disease Control, had a branch in Wuhan.
Exactly.
And the US closed that down. So
Exactly.
all of our pieces of surveillance were slowly breaking apart.
I think it was 40 scientists in Wuhan that because of budget cuts, they have to go back, right?
Yes, yes. It was budget cuts, but it was also politics as usual. As the administration in the United States changed, the opinion about whether or not this was a valuable thing to do changed. So it seems that the entire world understands now that testing may be one of the things that we need to do in order to reopen society. There are other ways, by the way, that we can reopen society, and this one is one of my favorites. So this is from nextstrain.org, and instead of tracking people through testing, they're tracking the virus itself through mutation. And this purple hotspot here is Wuhan itself. And what you can see is that every place there is a different color. The virus has has altered its genetic code. And you can see that looking this way on this diagram. And let's see, there's an animation here, and I'll see if I can run it since we're not in presenter mode. Let's go here, and we'll try here. Is the animation running? There we go. It's a little bit jerky in this mode, but you can see here with the purple, the virus is starting here in China, and as it begins to spread, because people are carrying it mostly through air travel, you can already see that there are massive changes in its genome. And that's continuing as you see it enter Australia, you see it enter the United States, Brazil down here, and Europe. So each of these manifestations of the virus has a slightly different genetic code. And one of the issues that's going to come up is as we do testing, who's infected and with which parts, which version of the virus are they infected? So this is a very familiar thing now. This is a South Korean actually testing somebody with a nasal swab. We have drive-through testing in the United States as well. Nikki, do you also have drive-through testing?
Yes.
Very similar to this. And it's quite protective. It's very efficient, and it's much more protective for the healthcare worker. And what they're doing here is they're actually amplifying, they're making additional copies. It's like photocopying the virus's RNA in order to detect it. So that's how they figure out that there is viral RNA there. The big thing everybody is talking about, how do we open an economy? We figure out who's immune, right? So in the United States, just last week, Roche was able to get an antibody test for emergency FDA approval. So that's our main regulatory body. There are a few problems with this. So the first problem with this is, let's say, Nikki, you or I were exposed to COVID and somebody actually tests us and it looks like we have antibodies. So what if your antibodies are different than my antibodies? Okay, so does that mean that you're immune? Does it mean I'm immune? Does it mean, Nikki, that in the wintertime, if you are re-exposed to COVID-19, that you are protected from it, or can you get it again? We don't even know this yet. We don't know if it's like polio also, where if we vaccinated you, you would develop immunity for the rest of your life. Or if we vaccinate you, it will be like the flu, that the virus keeps on mutating. And every time you mount a response, that response is useless the next time it comes around seasonally. So there are too many questions right now about whether or not prior exposure or having antibodies means that you're immune. Now, another really interesting way, and this is where you really start leveraging some of these exponential technologies, is the use of CRISPR. And not too many people are talking about this right now, but CRISPR has become known as this way of reading and writing DNA, right? Mm-hmm. So CRISPR, the enzyme Cas9, comes in and it searches for a base pair, set of base pairs, and it says, oh, there's a misspelling here. So we're going to now cut that and then replace it and fix it. Well, you can use the search function and use that alone to find pieces of viral RNA. So instead of using PCR, you do this. And there are 3 companies in a race for a CRISPR test. One of them is Mammoth Biosciences, and one of the co-founders is the co-founder of CRISPR. So this one comes out of Berkeley. There's one out of Argentina, in fact, But the third one is this group, and because of the way this is showing, I'm going to just see if I can bump this up a little so you can see.
Yeah.
Let's make it so you can see the whole slide. So this is the company that sort of beat everybody. This is Sherlock Biosciences. They are a spinoff from MIT. And this is actually from that second group who developed basically a CRISPR-based test. This one has now been FDA approved in the United States as of just a few days ago. And this is what's so extraordinary. The reagents, the materials that you need to do the tests cost about $6 US. So about €6, not much. And they're trying to simplify it so that they can put both phases of the test on one single cartridge and deliver it to you as a home test. There are color changes that take place. So it's almost like if you were taking a pregnancy test and peeing on a strip, you should be able to test COVID at home by using a piece of paper and looking for the color change. So that's really quite extraordinary.
This is COVID and not for the antibodies. This is just if you have.
This is for COVID. It's a great question. We don't have yet to home antibody test. One of the things is that you would need blood for the antibody test. So you either have to prick the finger or you have to draw the blood. And it's not clear that with pricking the finger, we have a good microfluidics platform yet to look for antibodies.
Yeah, if I might ask, we have a lot of people saying that don't use any home test because they're not reliable. Is this test reliable?
So far as we know, it is reliable. And your audience is incredibly smart. So here's the problem with home testing. Every time we get a false negative, whether it's PCR-based tests where we amplify the genome, or potentially in the case here of CRISPR, it's usually because the sample is not good, right? So you have to go way deep inside, like up the nose and around in order to get a good sample. And typically, if you're going to spit into something to get a sample, the saliva is usually not good enough unless you have tons and tons of virus. Usually you have to almost cough and cough something up. And so really the failures and the reliability have to do with the fact that nobody really wants to swab themselves the way they need to be swabbed.
Okay.
So that's a lot of what's going on. It's undersampling. It's undersampling bias. This CRISPR test might potentially be reliable enough, but we don't quite know yet because it's only been approved just now. So we'll have to see what happens when it goes into distribution. Everybody in your audience should know that no matter what, if there is a negative, if you get a negative back, it could be a false negative. I was tested because I work in the operating room. I was convinced I had it, but my test also came back negative. And that was with a drive-through swab. So another interesting piece of this is... Yeah. Sorry?
Did you test for antibodies just in case?
No, I haven't, because the antibody test has just been approved by Roche. And the antibody tests, I want to get one. Healthcare workers are and other essential workers are first in line. But as I mentioned, even if I have antibodies, we have no idea what that means. I could get sick in 1 month, right? Or I could still become an asymptomatic carrier. It could give you a false sense of, I'm okay. And then you could turn around and give it to somebody very vulnerable. So there are still problems even if I get the antibody test. Here's another thing about tracking. So have you guys started doing smartphone-based tracking in Greece?
As far as I know, not yet.
Not yet.
What we have a task force that they start doing sampling that is random sampling. They say that this is the way forward, to do random sampling to understand what is the penetration of the virus, not in biased or in unbiased ways, to understand.
Right. Everybody. So basically everybody will get tested. So that is testing for actual prevalent cases. This is slightly different. Here, this is the idea of contact tracing. So COVID Watch is a consortium that came from Stanford University in Silicon Valley. Tina White was the executive director. And the idea was that if you were wandering around and you had an app on your phone and your phone was constantly sending a Bluetooth signal to other people, which was hashed and privatized. In fact, take a look. This is the original group. They have a number of privacy and security advisors as well, because this was very important to people. But the idea was that the phones would ping one another if you had consented to download the app. And if you became COVID-19 positive, you would then tell your phone, tell the app, and the app would then be able to notify anybody who had been around your phone without telling them who it was. So that was the key. Somebody would know that they had been exposed to COVID-19 without knowing exactly who that was, so that there wouldn't be any retaliation or bias against them. And this is exactly what Google and Apple took to team up to create this COVID tracing app. And what's interesting is, first of all, they don't have great penetration yet. And in fact, they were revising the app. So the current version hasn't been released. But they brought it to the UK. And the UK said, no, thank you. We don't want a decentralized contact tracing app. We want a centralized one. So again, I have to ask, what do you think Greece is going, how is Greece going to respond to this?
I think we will, I mean, that's my opinion. And for whatever it makes sense, I think a more centralized one will make sense, because you need to know.
Yeah.
I know people, and to your questions, how Greece responded, I think Greece has responded extremely well. We like our churches, and we like going there, and
yes.
big deal, because we do a lot of family stuff with friends and family, and we celebrate. And to my surprise, everybody was extremely disciplined. People, they didn't go to churches, out, they throw fireworks. And
yeah, that was like one of the first slides I showed, right? With Greece being, look at it, it's an empty church. I mean, I never thought I would see this. You know, I don't know in the Greek people if you have the same feeling as...
Here, sorry, in the chat from Nick Papandreou that says that Greeks want to avoid sharing personal info via private sector companies, Apple. And there is a political cost involved in applying tracking here. You know, there is not a right answer. There is democracy, ethical consideration, the right to your privacy. I mean, is there a stigma if I have COVID or if I have antibodies? And do people will avoid me? I've read interviews from people that they had been seriously ill. And a lady was asking, she was wondering, I don't know if my friends and neighbors will talk to me, or they will afraid that I will infect them, or it will come back and infect them at some point. So there are a lot of questions. People, we are just coming out of the quarantine, and I don't know what will be the aftermath and how people will feel about other people.
So there's I would say both of you are right. So both the person who asked the question in the chat and you. So there is a public health concern. Both of these come, so this is COVID Watch. I wanted to just quickly mention to you, there's another project in the US, but it's an international project. It's out of MIT. It's called Safe Paths. My friend Ramesh Raskar is leading it. But again, they are completely, they encrypt and hash everything. And right now, these are distributed systems. I just co-founded a company to build a privacy-centered database like this, where public health officials can use this to get a sense of where the hotspots are, but still anonymize data from people so that we don't hurt them in some way. You know, again, this is very political, it depends on the country, but if you have a communicable disease, something, for instance, like HIV, it's not like, if you come to a clinic, it's not like somebody can call even in the United States, we can't even call your partner, your wife, your husband, whomever, and tell them. But it does get banked in a database because it's so highly transmissible. And there is a way to still be able to protect people from retaliation without sharing their personal information. I want to make another point. This is what we don't want to happen. As we open economies and we make choices about how do we surveil this pandemic and maybe future pandemics, I think we don't want to turn into China, because what China has done is it's been deploying drones, and they have been actually mounting cameras onto the drones and loudspeakers in order to track people.
I've seen a video that it was a lady walking on the street. Yes.
Here, this is one of them.
Can you play it?
Yes, I'm trying.
Crowd blaring a warning. The operator, a local traffic cop.
You, the handsome man with the telephone. Where's your mark?
Hey, you on the bike. Put on your mask when you're in the street. Don't endanger your fellow citizens.
Not all the drones are operated by public officials. Some of the clips have been posted by social media influencers hoping to encourage prevention.
Yes, Mom, it's the drone talking to you. You shouldn't come out without a mask. Go back inside and wash your hands. The drone can see.
So
unbelievable.
Show that because there are
magnet, or that when you open the door, if you are in quarantine, they get a notification and then they come pick you up. Or
there are reports of people being welded inside their homes in China. That is, I mean, they literally took the metal and they welded it so they couldn't leave. So we don't want to make this choice. We don't want surveillance in order to be agile in response to a future pandemic to mean the whole world turns into this. That they can't be out. It's definitely not a democratic choice, right? People are culturally attuned to doing different things. By the way, it's this kind of thing that also prevents organizations like the WHO from going into countries like this, because they control their media, they control their surveillance, they control everything. But ultimately, everybody wants this. They want an immunity passport, right? Because this is how they feel that they're going to open up the world.
Okay, before we go there, a quick question.
Yeah.
We talked about the CDC and the Wuhan, that there was a team there that they left. Do you believe that if the team in Wuhan, they haven't left because of budget cuts or what politically was decided to move away, do you think that they will have a better idea and understanding about the virus and about and have an early warning for the US also?
I 100% do. For so many reasons. One, that's eyes and ears on the ground. It's local, right? So that they would be able to see what was going on and respond back to WHO and respond to Washington. So you already saw how many doctors and scientists were trying to tell people what were happening. They were passing it along to local government officials in China, and the information was getting basically squashed, right? It was being censored. Had there been any representative of an international organization on the ground there, I don't think they would have been able to pull that off. And we would have had information probably back in November of 2019 when the first cases came about. And, you know, Nikki, as you and I know, exponentials are powerful. Even a couple of days of not having information with a virus that spreads to 2 to 3 people, that's a very, very steep exponential curve, and things get out of control quickly. So I wanted to,
when it gets one, that's the exponential power. Everything that is happening before it gets a critical mass, it's small. That's why it's imperceptible, and then start shooting exponentials, you know, are unstoppable.
Absolutely. And, you know, this brings me also to another problem we have. So as everybody's saying, let's open up society. Economies can't take this anymore. We're hitting a new global depression. You have to now think about this. There are a few places in the world where there aren't clusters of vulnerable people, right? So this is from the UNHCR, the UN Human Rights Commission. I'm going to try to move this out of the way. But they're dealing with coronavirus outbreaks in 131 refugee hosting countries, 71 million people. And I went to their site to understand, and they're scaling up local services in Greece. I mean, as you know, you have a very large migrant population. Yeah. Now, what's the problem? So there are several. The biggest problem, and for instance, I was also pinged by a country in Africa, and they were saying to me, hey, is it possible for us to wash our hands for 20 seconds by creating one soapy bowl for the entire village. Because they have no running water, no soap.
Yeah.
And if you can't even enact the most basic of hygiene, right? How is it that you could possibly hope to stop the spread of this virus? If you have no masks, if you're living on top of one another and you can't socially distance, there's no way. And, you know, it's not just Greece. This is one of our US border camps, right? These are people coming in from the southern border. Look at how they're packed on top of each other. I mean, these are cesspools, right? Our prisons are having problems. We have a huge incarceration problem in the United States. So any place where there's overcrowding, obviously in nursing homes, but I mean, these are very vulnerable people and they don't have access. So one of the things, and this is part of that OneShared.world initiative, we are only as safe as the most vulnerable people on the planet, not even in your own hometown or school, on the planet. Borders are porous and they're fluid, and the virus knows no border. And if we cannot help our fellow citizens, we will not be able to protect ourselves from future pandemics. So now, Nikki, you also asked me about vaccines, right? So that
the immune passport.
Hmm?
We are about to talk to the immune passport, no?
Yeah, no, this is actually all part of that. Can we actually give people an immune passport? So one way to do it is herd immunity, but we can't get herd immunity if large migrant populations are constantly spreading it. There's no way to develop that herd. The second thing people ask about is whether vaccination will provide herd immunity. I will say something interesting here. In the past, it has taken anywhere from 2 to 5 years to develop vaccines against different viruses, but this time has been different. So even though they didn't tell us in November, when the Chinese did provide the genetic code in mid-January of this virus, the sequence, and it was actually the scientists who did so, immediately, because again of exponential technologies, scientists around the world were able to leverage this to develop a new kind of vaccine technology. And those vaccine technologies were genetic vaccines, things like mRNA and DNA vaccines. So Moderna, which is one of the mRNA vaccines, and by the way, they've been working on this for Ebola, even to fight cancers. Essentially what you do is instead of taking inactivated virus or fragments of virus proteins and injecting them into somebody to form an immune response, which takes a long time to do, they just take the genetic code, inject it into a human, and let our cells make copies that we can form an immune response to. So Moderna is in clinical trials right now. And by the way, there are vaccine trials all over the world. This one I thought was a very interesting one. So in Pittsburgh, they're developing a DNA vaccine, and you see this thing that this man is holding on his fingertip. This is a microarray of needles, and it's essentially a vaccine patch. There's a friend of mine, Mark Kendall in Australia, does something very similar. And you take the patch and you just stick it on yourself. You can't even feel the needles because they don't penetrate beyond the dermis. And this DNA vaccine now gets early access to the cells that need to incorporate it and present it to your antibodies. So this is really an amazing movement forward. There's one other very interesting thing, and I don't know how many people in your audience have heard about this, but recently people have been talking about more generalized or innate immunity. Typically, we make very specific responses with our vaccines to viral particles, but people have been noticing that in places in the world where things like tuberculosis are endemic and they get things like the BCG vaccination, which we don't do in the US, but they do it in places like India, there have been much, much lower prevalence rates of COVID-19. And in general, in some places, people who are vaccinated against polio, against tuberculosis, become sick at a rate 75% less than other people across the board. And the thought is that they have developed something called innate immunity, which allows them, it's like the immune system is revved up and it learns how to respond very, very quickly, like an elite Olympic athlete, to new challenges to the immune system. So this is also in trials all over the world. And finally, you know, exponential type.
Let me understand better what you say. If you have been getting the vaccination for tuberculosis, and what was the other one?
Polio is another example.
Polio.
Smallpox. Smallpox is another one.
Yeah, there. So actually, it's like you train your system to respond better to any other threat. So at 70% of the cases, if you had any of the 3 vaccinations, you weather better. You don't get it by 64%.
Yes. Yeah, it's almost another way that you might see this is in countries where they have many more immune challenges. Their immune system is more robust and it can handle new challenges. But this is a very specific way of activating an immune system. I also want to make mention of the fact that
in our chat, Angeliki Kopsini, that she says that in Greece, we are also taking the BCG vaccination. So maybe, I don't know.
Oh, it's possible. That's a really interesting, I didn't know that. So all of you get it, or just small pockets of areas where they're worried about TB?
All of us.
You all get a BCG. Okay, so we don't in the US.
Thank you for the for the discussion here and the input. That's the beauty of this salon. Do you have you all?
Yes. So this is really interesting, whomever brought this up. So there seems to be some sort of a loose correlation between countries who vaccinate their people for other things and a robust immune response against COVID. If that happens to be the case, that gives me a lot of hope, because then you don't need to develop a specific immune response. I would be remiss if I didn't mention to everybody that we're leveraging artificial intelligence to repurpose drugs as well. But I wanted to give you another final piece of hope. Long before we were exposed to this particular coronavirus, CoV-2, the thing that causes COVID-19, people were already searching for a universal flu vaccine. And if it works on other coronaviruses, the chances that it would work on this coronavirus are very high. And the key here is, can you find a part of the vaccine, right? This is the neuraminidase. This is a protein. This is another protein. For those of you who've heard of things like the swine flu, which was called H1N1, it is based on the H here and the N here. So at these different parts, as they're put together, that's how viruses are identified. It's their address tag. It's what they wear. It's their visage. And in this case, if we can find the parts of the virus that don't mutate and make the vaccine against that part, you would only need to get vaccinated once, and you would not only have immunity against that, like for instance, the flu virus every season, but all related coronaviruses. So they're looking for that kind of conserved vaccine. There's already one in trials in the United States as of almost about a year ago to the day. So they're doing clinical trials for this kind of thing. And if they prove to be effective, we may have something for this particular virus as well. In order to open up, also, we were talking about this idea of, you mentioned to me, Nikki, that you guys, by sheltering in place, flattened your curve pretty quickly. And that was really important because it didn't overwhelm your healthcare capacity, which is critical. And it's, in fact, the difference between the way New York and California responded just by waiting one extra week, and probably also being a travel hotspot in New York City and having a lot of exposure from all over the world and not closing its borders. New York City, it suffered. I mean, my friends who work there were getting sick at alarming rates. They were dying. They started running out of ventilators. We didn't in California. We thought we might. We never did. We do have a PPE problem, right? This issue. Here's actually me wearing PPE in the operating room in order to intubate patients. In fact, we had started intubating COVID positive patients underneath plastic drapes so that they wouldn't aerosolize COVID-19 all over the place. But despite all of this, we were doing much better. And I would say that one of the reasons that Greece has weathered this crisis is because its hospitals didn't become overwhelmed. But if we open too early or in the wrong way or re-expose people, the hospital, that line for surge capacity could be overwhelmed. And that's what we don't want when we reopen. Sorry, that slide is out of place. Another way that people are being incredibly clever, there are global open source projects to build capacity. So this is one of many open source ventilators. I've been mentoring a company that's actually 3D printing a ventilator right now. And the idea is that they are partnering with a company called Carbon 3D, and they can print one ventilator every 15 minutes, and they pack it up in a tiny little briefcase. And so it's not just rapid, it's portable. So if it's no longer needed in a particular area, it can be moved easily to someplace else that needs it. So this is another way. Just like we're doing this instead of in person and enjoying a glass of wine together, we've started doing these things virtually over Zoom. Well, medicine has moved to a virtual place. In fact, in the United States, we like to think we're agile, and sometimes we are really crappy at moving to great solutions. So for instance, telemedicine, it was really difficult to adopt telemedicine in the US. You couldn't get paid for it. Everybody was worried about privacy issues. And take a look here at this sort of growth. That's on an exponential curve. We are working, the company that I'm building, we're working to be the privacy data hub in order to enable telemedicine to take place, for us to work with different architectures. So you have one place, or one, I wouldn't say one human, but you have one place where you can not only track who's sick, who's intubated in the hospital, this is the contact tracing piece of it. But what resources do we have? So can you get a ventilator to send out an RFID signal like an Amazon Go store to basically tell you where all the ventilators are? And can you bank and database that sort of thing? So that's really critically important. Sensor technology, right? So if I'm actually now credentialed as a telehealth physician, and when I interact with a patient, we can do a virtual visit. I can teach them how to take their pulse and check their respiratory rate. But if we had sensors that were connected, that could stream me their vital signs, that would be even better. And it would also be a way of monitoring patients we were really worried about, for instance, in nursing homes. And again, that same colleague of mine who developed a patch vaccine in Melbourne, Australia, has now developed a cytokine patch that can be used to constantly sample biomarkers in the bloodstream. And it can tell you if somebody is going to go into a cytokine storm before it happens. So there are some really, really clever new wearables that are coming online. Another way I think we're going to open up our economy is to limit face-to-face risky kinds of interactions. So this is the idea of building more robotic doctors. And in fact, there's even a company, VBot, that has found a way to develop a robot that can actually draw blood and start IVs without a human. So this might be somewhat protective, especially in the heart of a pandemic. But so one of the things that, especially, you talked that I was working with I was advising someone in the governor's office on the task force for opening the economy. One thing I said to him is that in order to get people back into public places, we're really going to need a system for sanitization in a way we've never had before. And one of our first targets is public transportation. And so I suggest to him that we start deploying UV lights everywhere. And so I'm now working on some of the specs that would be needed to open up San Francisco Bay Area rapid transit systems with my friend Nishan. So we're working together to figure out what that's going to require. There are some other really clever things that you can do.
There's a lot of debate about UV light. So you say the UV light actually kills coronavirus?
So it kills 99.9% of related coronaviruses. They're still doing studies on this particular one, SARS-CoV-2. But it does it for SARS, the other SARS in 2003, and MERS and other coronaviruses. It's incredibly effective. There are two things, Nikki. So one is which band you're in. So UVA and UVB do very little. So that's the stuff you get from the sun that passes through our atmosphere that gives you sunburn. Doesn't do much. UVC is much shorter in wavelength, but it still has a big band. And if you try to expose an area to the full bandwidth of UVC, it's dangerous to humans. They can't look at it. So they could damage their cornea, damage their skin. But there's actually a very particular band between 207 and 222 nanometers that is an incredible killing machine and doesn't penetrate the dead skin. It doesn't seem to get to your cells as a human. It doesn't penetrate the cornea and cause eye damage. So that's incredibly promising. And this is the bandwidth that I'm looking at right now to see what the power requirements are, how it falls off based on the distance, right? So let's say you see this tube here in this tunnel. Is it even going to reach the surface of the bus to kill something? How long do you need exposure for? There are even new robots that are being mounted with UV lights that can move through hospital rooms and public transit systems that are like sort of rotating and will just beam UVC light to all these surfaces. They're not good at getting things in shadow, right? Or imagine if you had like a telephone and it's facing down, so the part that you put near your ear or near your mouth obviously can't get sanitized. It also doesn't work well through strong layers of dirt. So if the area is very dirty, this method doesn't work as well. Now, sanitation, you remember I was saying the most vulnerable people, right? Forget UVC, you need at least water and soap for some people. But here's some interesting things. So one, first of all, we need more toilets in the world, right? And we also now know that COVID-19 is found in your feces and it can spread through fecal-oral spread, just like hepatitis A. And in fact, for all of you out there, please close the lid of your toilet when you flush it because it aerosolizes the virus into your bathroom. Essentially, as we deploy toilets, maybe we can deploy smart toilets that can start to analyze all of the waste that we're generating. So even if you are asymptomatic, your toilet will know if you are carrying COVID. And I'm going to give you an example right here. So these two women, they spun out a company from MIT. And essentially what they've been doing, they have this robot that goes down and samples sewage collection. And they can tell if there's COVID in the wastewater. Yeah. And so they recently published this paper in medRxiv. It has not yet been fully peer reviewed. So please take this with a grain of salt. So last month it's being reviewed now. But in a hotspot in Massachusetts where they thought there were only 155 active cases, they came up with over 100,000 probable cases just by analyzing their wastewater.
Yeah, I've heard about that. I don't remember who told me, but yeah, that is amazing.
Right, so then, we have to think about what is this actually, how can we do global surveillance in a way that is protective of people, but is also very efficient, right? Because sampling wastewater is much more efficient than sticking a swab in everybody's nose, right?
You can kind of understand early on.
Yeah, exactly. Now, just a couple of things so that we can finish and do Q&A. I want to mention that as we start to open up our planet, there are more people dying right now of hunger because of COVID-19 than of the complications of COVID-19. And so food security is something we need to take very seriously. Again, protecting the vulnerable. An interesting byproduct of all of this, as you and I spoke about, is that pollution seems to be getting better. So the Ganga River, the Ganges River, for the first time it's been fit to drink. It has actually been quite the cesspool because people would excrete into the river and they thought that the goddess would protect them from getting sick. But now you actually can drink water in certain areas. This is an example of air quality in different places. Compare Japan here in the middle, which went into lockdown, South Korea, which just did it through tracing and testing, but they didn't lock down. You can see that the air quality just next door in South Korea is much, much worse than the air quality in Japan. And I think everyone has probably seen these images from space of basically the pollution over China and especially close to the area of Wuhan, pre-COVID and then post-COVID.
Wow.
It's very, very dramatic, but here's the thing, right? So I am really concerned, Nick, as I told you, that even as we're improving some aspects of sustainability in our climate, we're doing other very bad things. So every time I wear a plastic face shield or those gloves, I throw them into landfill. And the number of uses of those have gone up exponentially as well, because it's not just healthcare workers now, it's everybody is wanting to use this. The second problem is everybody is not only washing their hands, but they're disinfecting their counters and bleaching things and whatnot. for all of you who have children between the ages of 0 and 5, just realize that your children are no longer getting exposed to the microbes that they need to build a healthy immune system. We're destroying the microbiome while we're trying to protect ourselves from coronavirus. And that has implications. So they will develop asthma at higher rates and basically all kinds of autoimmune diseases. And I was jokingly saying to Nikki the other day, I feel like we need to take these children and throw them in the dirt and then put their face near a dog's butt so that they can get all these these bacteria and viruses, re-exposure to all the things we're disinfecting in our homes. And then finally, the last thing I wanted to say is...
Sanitation. So the super sanitation is not a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of need to do it right now because this virus has been so deadly for some people. We now know there are children who are developing like this vascular inflammatory disease called Kawasaki's disease. We thought children would not really get a severe form and they're dying of it. So it's going into the brain, it's going into the heart, and who knows? There's a genetic reason for this, by the way. And there are world labs collaborating on trying to understand the genetics of susceptibility. But until we know this, that's another way we can't easily open up because we don't know who to protect. Finally, meat production, right? So China apparently was trying to permanently ban now these wet markets. And
it was about time.
Sorry?
It was about time.
Yes, it was about time. But here's the thing. It's not just China. In the United States, we have factory farms. In fact, there was another outbreak a few weeks ago of a different kind of bird flu in a turkey farm. And it's because we pack these animals in and they're stressed and they're excreting waste. This is a setup for all kinds of zoonotic spread. And it may mean that, again, exponential technology, not just plant-based meats, but cellular-based meats may be the new way to basically bypass some of these kinds of conditions that lead to zoonotic spread. So just to end with this idea, you're never, we don't always fight wars, but we do have sort of a standing defense system just in case, right? We need to have a standing defense system for future global pandemics so we don't go crazy like this in the future. And it's this thing, and it's going to be global, and it will be interdependent. And that's if I could end with anything at all, this is the thing that I would like you all to take away. So let's do Q&A, please. Yeah.
So, Divya, I think the most hot question is Greece have survived the crisis. We have flattened the curve. Now, as of this week, all stores are open. Students will be back. Schools will open at some point. We have the final exams. And we are a touristic country. We want to have back tourists. How you open up a touristic country? So there are many challenges. So should people who want to visit Greece take the test, the COVID test, and then we will know that at least if they don't get sick in the next 5 days, how people can travel.
Yeah, this is one of the hardest things about opening up the global economy. So that Greece is still quarantining travelers. So even as it opens the country to locals, it is still asking anybody who wants to come into the country to wait for 14 days. So they will quarantine them. And here's the problem. Let's say you take a COVID test, or let's say I take an antibody test and I have antibodies. Can I come to Greece to visit you, Nikki, and have a glass of wine? What if the strain in Greece, and we believe it is actually, the European strains differ from the American strains, and there may be differences even in the US and the East and West Coast. What if what I have developed antibodies to is different than the version of the virus near you? I could still infect you, you could still infect me. And so I think in the very near term, travel will be one of the things hit the hardest. And I think that locally, we will find ways of interacting with one another before we can start interacting again globally. And as you know, all of us from Singularity, we're traveling all over the world. I mean, it's actually very painful for us to be, not just stuck in our home, but stuck in San Francisco. this one is going to take a much longer period of time, I think.
Okay.
And that is where, by the way, your economy, this is where, even though Greece has done so well weathering the virus, whether the economy is going to survive this because of the tourism dependence is a big, big deal.
True, true. So we need to find, I think the government, and they need to find creative ways or see how we can help the touristic sector. What about the temperature? I've heard that the temperature, I've read actually in the newspaper that the temperature that it's more highly to get it is around 8 centigrade Celsius, and every point above that, it makes it less and less likely to spread. Is this the case? Is it true? Do we know that for sure? So, maybe people think that if it's 20, 30 centigrades, 40 that is in Greece, then you are secure.
No, it's 25 centigrade here. In Salt Lake City, it's 80 degrees, so it's about 30-ish centigrade. People are getting it like crazy. People are getting it in the southern hemisphere. People are getting it near the equator. So it's a false sense of security, this temperature dependence.
Okay, so we had the hope maybe it is a temperature that
there may be some susceptibility issues, and so the waves that you see everything may be amplified when it's a bit colder. It's possible, for sure. But it's passing and transmissible even in temperate climates, even in warm climates. So, okay, so we have lots of interesting questions. There are 2 questions related to the contact tracing with the smartphones, right? Mm-hmm. So one person is asking, saying Greeks want to avoid sharing personal data via especially Apple and Google, yes. And then another person is saying, but could you expand upon this? This is a business opportunity. So I agree with both. Just so you know, for the record, I don't use Google for my searches. I use DuckDuckGo. I have a VPN on all my devices. What they do is they take your query and then they send it out to all these different search engines, including Google, but they do it with their own IP address. So your IP address is never revealed. And there's almost no detectable latency difference. I mean, I can't detect milliseconds, right? So you can basically get back search results without telling Google what you were searching for. And again, like I said, I have VPNs on all my devices. I actually use encrypted cloud storage. And I also have Proton Mail for encrypted mail communication if I need that. So whoever asked me this, somebody named Nick, I am very sensitive to privacy. The company that I'm founding it's related to the question down there. We do believe that contact tracing will be important to public health. So we are trying to build a database system that all of you remember there was first when we started using the internet, we used phones and modems, right? Dial-up. Then there was an IP, internet protocols, right? Right? You would wait forever, right? Yeah. And then for calling, there was something called voice over IP. You can put layers on top of our current IP protocols that not only encrypt when you send and encrypt when you receive, but encrypt the entire way. And so we're looking to build that kind of connected database system that can amalgamate data, including this contact tracing from smartphones, but do so in a way that is private. So if somebody tried to intercept that, they still could not decrypt what it is that we're collecting. Now, for the person who's asking about the technology, essentially, and if you go to COVID Watch or to SafePads, they give a nice description. You can read more about the white papers on both the technology and the privacy. But essentially, you take your phone, and your phone, if you have the app on the phone, it's giving off a Bluetooth signal. And let's say, Nikki, you and I are in the same place, and you also downloaded the app. And then we have about 20 people around us. And then you and I were like in the same grocery store, okay? And it turns out I test COVID-19 positive. I tell the phone, that phone sends an encrypted signal to all the Bluetooth phones with the app in my area to say, there's somebody around you that has COVID-19. And now you can react in the appropriate way. One, you might decide to get tested. Two, you may decide, before I get tested, maybe I have a 90-year-old grandmother at home. Maybe I need to be a little bit careful and isolate her, etc. And so in such a way, without knowing whose data it was, because the signal sent is encrypted, it's hashed, you might still understand what your own risk is. And it can be decentralized or centralized. And that's what the UK was saying. We want a centralized system. We know that a lot of the Asian countries that got through this with contact tracing, it was extraordinarily centralized to the government. The US is more like Greece.
In that, but when one of your contacts has been diagnosed with COVID, then your access becomes from green, orange, or red, and you are locked down.
Yes, that's exactly right.
So who is using this information? Who has access to it?
So in the case of the COVID Watch app and the MIT version, no central authority gets any access to it. It can be used for public health tracking, but they don't know it's you. They could never lock you down.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Just so you know, though, if you go for that COVID-19 test, they do know it's you, right? I mean, that is intimately related to you. So if you find out that you have COVID-19 in the first place, somebody knows, public health at least knows, but your neighbors don't have to find out, right? People who might come to your house and throw rocks at you don't have to find out. So it does protect you that way.
Yes, hopefully my neighbors don't throw rocks at me.
No, I'm sure they love you. So,
so let me ask you the following. I was really taken by the fact that there are different strains in different geographies and they mutate. Do we know that for sure? I mean, is this established or we just don't know and it might be happening?
We absolutely know it mutates now. What we don't know, Nikki, is whether those mutations matter. So there are a couple of interesting principles. One is if a virus is more deadly and it kills its host, it's likely it will kill its host before it can pass itself on to someone else, a new host. So viruses that are more deadly tend to stay more localized and they don't go very far. The ones that are very contagious are usually less deadly. And we are already seeing differences in the virulence or how deadly the strains are in certain places. The European strains seem worse, actually, than what came to the US. But it could be, again, highly localized. Italy, Spain, terribly virulent strains. By the way, of all the countries in the world, Spain has the highest per capita testing rate as of now, higher than anywhere else in the world, which is quite extraordinary. But again, we don't know if a Spanish person who develops antibodies in response to that strain, if they went to New York City, whether they would be immune. This is an active area of research, and this is going to relate to the vaccines that we make, whether we have to bundle lots of vaccines into one injection, that basically these antibodies, are they basically hitting different parts of the spike protein, or can we find that conserved vaccine? And then the mutation won't matter. So even if it mutates, as long as you find one thing that's the same, that stays the same, right, then you won't have to worry about it. If you change your clothes and you change your, the shirt you wear a dress on a different day, there are parts of you, like your arm or your wrist, that don't change. And that's what we're looking for.
Things that they don't change, so we can attack them universally.
Yes. So we can form our vaccines and our antibodies to that. We also didn't mention the fact that people are donating their blood and their plasma who have recovered. But we also don't know if they give it to somebody else, if that's going to protect them from the strain that they're exposed to. So the plasma thing needs to be locally, at least, to make sure that, whatever strain. Most likely it'll work locally first, but they're going to have to do studies to see if it's more generalizable.
So a lot of work ahead of us.
A lot of work ahead of us, yeah.
I think right now we are at the end of our salon. Any closing remarks? Anything you want to leave us with? I mean, what are you optimistic about? Do you want to leave our attendees and our friends attending our salon with any closing remarks?
Yeah, that we are all in this together. We all need to love one another. We all need to care for one another. what happens to somebody who seems so far away from me in an African village, that impacts me. It impacts me as a human, as a caring human, but it also impacts my health. And so I think that we need to now fully recognize that we are in an era of interconnectedness, and that in that interconnectedness, we'll both problem solve together, but we must care for one another. And we need to protect those ideals that we hold dear. You know, people have been asking me a lot about personal rights, democracy. When people are hungry, when people are hurting, then they get angry and they pick up weapons or they fight wars. And so we lose our civil liberties in the face of fear. And we don't want to become those people. We want to live a world of love and caring. So that's what I would end with.
Thank you so much, Divya. It was a pleasure to have you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much.
And hope to have you soon.
I look forward to it. Yes. Take care, everybody. Good night.